A CEO's polished office, with its sleek, modern decor and panoramic views of Detroit, was a symbol of power, intimidating to most, but not to him. He had walked through those doors with confidence, wearing a quiet strength that came from years of resilience and hard work. But the moment he stepped into that boardroom, he could feel the tension in the air, the kind that wasn't just about business negotiations. It was personal, layered, and thick with something far more insidious. The meeting had barely started when the CEO's gaze fell on him, his expression shifting into a smirk that carried a familiar weight of arrogance. The room was full, every chair occupied by men and women in suits, but all eyes seemed to be on this one, unassuming figure, someone they hadn't expected to see at the table. The CEO's lips twisted, as if savoring the words before he let them loose, a calculated move designed to wound. "Who let him in?" The CEO's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and cold, echoing around the room. "I thought we were meeting with someone who actually mattered today." The silence was deafening, the shock rippling through the room. Some of the executives exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others just shifted in their seats, unsure how to react. But he didn't flinch. He held his ground, jaw clenched, eyes steady. This wasn't the first time he had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just a casual slight, it was a deliberate act of humiliation, in front of an audience. The CEO, leaning back in his chair, continued. "Did they run out of errand boys at the front desk? What could you possibly contribute here?" He didn't even look up from the papers in front of him, treating the moment like an annoyance, a waste of his precious time. "We're here to talk numbers, investments, real business, things you clearly don't understand." The insult was loud, clear, and it landed right where it was aimed, squarely at the heart. In that moment, the atmosphere shifted, and it wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was a reminder of every stereotype, every prejudice, and every barrier that had been put up to keep people like him from the top. And everyone in that room knew it. They felt the sting of it, the rawness of an attack that wasn't just professional but deeply personal. Still, he said nothing. He let the CEO's words hang in the air, heavy and venomous. He knew what was at stake. He knew this meeting was crucial, not just for business, but for something far bigger than anyone in that room could imagine. But what they didn't know was that he had come prepared. They had no idea what was about to unfold. The CEO's smirk grew wider, more confident, as if he had already won whatever unspoken game he was playing. "I think we're done here. We don't need to waste time on fantasies and pipe dreams. Why don't you go back to, wherever it is you came from, and let the adults handle the real business?" The room erupted into awkward chuckles, the kind that masked discomfort and complicity. The CEO had made his point, he was in control, and anyone who didn't fit his mold was beneath him. It was the kind of power play that had worked for him countless times before, and he saw no reason why it wouldn't work now. After all, in his mind, this was just another phase he'd forget, another obstacle easily dismissed. But the man across from him wasn't just another face. And he wasn't going to be dismissed. There was a reason he had chosen to sit silently and absorb every word, every sneer, every derisive laugh. There was a reason he hadn't reacted, hadn't tried to defend himself or argue. It wasn't because he couldn't, it was because he didn't need to. The real reason he was here, sitting quietly at that table, was because he already knew something the CEO didn't. Something that would turn that smirk into shock, and that arrogance into regret. The humiliation, the condescension, it was all part of a game the CEO thought he was winning. But he didn't know that the game was about to change, and the rules were no longer in his favor. Because the man he had just humiliated wasn't just some hopeful investor trying to pitch an idea. He was the new owner, and he had bought the company right from under the CEO's nose. Quietly, strategically, and without ever needing to prove his worth to anyone but himself. But as he sat there, still calm, still composed, he didn't reveal it just yet. No, he let the moment stretch, let the CEO bask in his perceived victory, let him believe he had asserted his dominance. Because sometimes, the best way to show strength is to wait for the perfect moment, to let those who think they have won see the truth only when it's too late for them to do anything about it. And that moment was coming. The CEO thought he had played his final card, but he was about to see a hand he didn't even know existed. What would happen when the truth was finally revealed? When the CEO realized that the man he had just dismissed, the man he had insulted in front of his peers, was the one holding all the power? What would he do when he saw everything slipping through his fingers, not because of a hostile takeover or a corporate scandal, but because of his own arrogance and ignorance? This is a story of power, prejudice, and poetic justice. A story where karma doesn't just knock on the door, it breaks it down. You've seen the humiliation, but will you stay to see the ultimate revenge? The kind that comes not with anger, but with a quiet, calculated smile, and a signature on the dotted line. Stay tuned. Before we dive into today's story, I want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. We believe in equality, respect, and justice for everyone. To all our viewers, especially those who have faced prejudice or injustice, we see you, we support you, and we're here to amplify stories that matter. Now, sit back and get ready for an emotional, powerful journey. And if you enjoy this story, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell. It helps us keep bringing you content with heart, twists, and lessons that resonate. Enjoy the story. Jerome Turner had always been a man of quiet resolve. Growing up in the heart of Detroit, he had learned early on that success didn't come easily, especially when the odds were stacked against you. His parents, both factory workers, had instilled in him the values of hard work, perseverance, and dignity. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough to keep them going. As a young boy, Jerome often watched his father come home late, exhausted yet proud, and his mother do everything she could to keep the family together. It was those moments that shaped him, that taught him the importance of resilience. Jerome carried those lessons into adulthood. He excelled in school, not because it was easy, but because he refused to give up. His academic achievements earned him scholarships, and soon, he found himself at a prestigious university, one where he was often one of the few black faces in a sea of privileged, unfamiliar ones. He learned to navigate that world with a quiet strength, understanding that every step forward was a statement, a defiance of the unspoken rules that tried to limit where he could go. After graduating at the top of his class, Jerome entered the world of finance, a field that was competitive, ruthless, and, for someone like him, unwelcoming. But he was good at what he did. Very good. He had a mind for numbers, a knack for spotting opportunities, and, most importantly, the ability to see potential where others only saw risk. Over the years, he built a name for himself as an astute investor, someone who could turn struggling companies into success stories. Yet, despite his achievements, Jerome never sought the spotlight. He preferred to work quietly, letting his results speak for themselves. But that's not to say he didn't have ambition. Jerome's vision extended beyond just making money. He wanted to create opportunities, to invest in businesses that were often overlooked by the major players. Small enterprises, minority-owned startups, and companies that had the potential to change their communities. For him, every investment was a chance to prove that success didn't have to follow the same old, narrow path that so many people assumed it did. It was this philosophy that led him to look into a mid-sized tech company based in Detroit, a firm that had been struggling for a few years but had the potential to turn things around with the right leadership. And Jerome knew he could be that leader. On the other side of this story was William Cross, CEO of the same tech company, Cross Innovations. To the world, William was seen as a self-made businessman, someone who had turned a modest startup into a multi-million-dollar company. But those who knew him well, or had the misfortune of working closely with him, saw a different side. William was ruthless, arrogant, and, above all, dismissive of anyone he didn't consider to be part of his inner circle. His success had made him believe he was invincible, and that arrogance bled into every aspect of how he ran his company. William was the kind of man who believed in appearances. He drove the most expensive cars, wore the finest suits, and hosted lavish parties to show off his status. To him, business was as much about perception as it was about profit. If you didn't look the part, you didn't belong in his world. Over the years, he had surrounded himself with people who fed his ego, yes, men who never questioned his authority. It made William feel powerful, untouchable, as if his decisions were the only ones that mattered. But it also blinded him to the cracks that were beginning to form within his company. Cross Innovations had seen better days. Recent years had been marked by declining sales, internal disputes, and a lack of direction. William, of course, would never admit it, but the company was in trouble. He needed investors, new money to help steady the ship and keep his empire from crumbling. But William wasn't just looking for money, he was looking for investors who fit his image, people who looked and acted like him. When he heard that someone was interested in investing a significant amount, he was intrigued. That was, until he saw Jerome. The first meeting between the two men was scheduled in the boardroom of Cross Innovations. Jerome had arrived early, as he always did, dressed sharply yet understated, with a calm and confident demeanor. He took his seat at the long, glass-topped table, waiting for the discussion to begin. When William finally entered, flanked by a few of his executives, he barely glanced at Jerome. It was a small, subtle snub, but one that spoke volumes. As the meeting commenced, William's demeanor shifted from indifferent to openly dismissive. He interrupted Jerome mid-sentence, ignored his suggestions, and made a point to steer the conversation away whenever Jerome tried to bring up his vision for the company's future. But it was when William leaned back in his chair, looked straight at Jerome, and said, "I don't think you understand the scale of what we're dealing with here. This isn't some neighborhood project, you're out of your league," that the room went silent. The words hung in the air, cold and deliberate, a clear attempt to put Jerome in his place. It was a moment that could have broken a lesser man, could have made him question everything. But Jerome didn't let it show. Instead, he just smiled, a small, controlled smile that hid what he was truly thinking. He had dealt with men like William his entire life, men who thought that power was something you could wear like a suit, that respect was something you could buy. Jerome knew better. Power wasn't about loud voices and flashy cars, it was about control, and right now, William didn't realize just how much control he was about to lose. For the rest of the meeting, Jerome played the part William expected, calm, polite, unthreatening. He let William dismiss him, belittle him, all while quietly taking note of everything that was said, every arrogance-filled smirk, every word that dripped with condescension. Jerome knew that William had no idea who he was really dealing with, no idea what plans had already been set in motion. And that was exactly how Jerome wanted it. Detroit had taught Jerome to play the long game, to see the bigger picture. He didn't need to win every battle, just the ones that mattered. And as he walked out of that boardroom, head held high, he knew that this was only the beginning. William thought he had put Jerome in his place, but in truth, he had just set the stage for his own downfall. Because Jerome wasn't there to seek validation or approval, he was there to take over. And the wheels were already in motion. The days following that tense meeting in the boardroom felt like a strange calm before an impending storm. For William Cross, it was business as usual. He went about his routine with the same confidence, that same smug satisfaction of a man who thought he had everything under control. He'd managed to brush off yet another ambitious investor, and in his mind, that was just how things worked. Men like him didn't need to explain themselves to anyone, especially not to someone who didn't fit his narrow vision of success. But for Jerome Turner, that meeting had been the first move in a much larger game. He hadn't walked out of Cross Innovations defeated, he'd left with a plan. For weeks, he had been quietly buying up shares, a little at a time, ensuring that his presence on the company's radar remained invisible. It was a strategy built on patience, on letting William's arrogance blind him to the reality of what was happening. Every dismissive comment, every act of condescension, was fuel for Jerome, a reminder of why this was more than just a business opportunity, it was personal. Jerome had seen men like William all his life. They were the ones who thought they could decide who was worthy and who wasn't, who looked down on anyone who didn't walk, talk, or dress like them. But what William didn't realize was that, in his attempt to belittle Jerome, he had underestimated the one thing he couldn't afford to, Jerome's resolve. 2 weeks after their initial meeting, Jerome found himself in a different room, this time at a quiet cafe in downtown Detroit, sitting across from Robert Pierce, one of Cross Innovation's largest shareholders. Robert was a veteran in the tech industry, someone who had seen the company grow from a small startup to the sizable firm it was now. And he was well aware of the problems festering beneath the surface, problems that William had been too proud, or too blind, to address. "You see, Robert," Jerome began, his tone calm but deliberate, "I'm not just interested in helping this company survive. I want to see it thrive. But that can't happen if the man at the top refuses to change." He leaned in slightly, his eyes locking onto Robert's, making sure his message was clear. "William's pride is going to bring this company down, and we both know it." Robert listened, nodding slightly, though his expression remained cautious. "You're not wrong," he said finally. "But William's been running this company his way for years. You think you can just walk in and convince the board to kick him out?" Jerome didn't smile, but there was a quiet confidence in his voice. "I don't need to convince them of anything. I just need to show them the numbers. The truth is, William's leadership has been costing this company more than it can afford, and the shareholders are starting to feel it. All I'm doing is giving them a better option." Robert took a sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jerome. "And what exactly is your plan?" The room seemed to grow quieter as Jerome laid it out, his words precise, each step carefully mapped out. He spoke of strategic investments, partnerships that could revitalize the company's struggling sectors, and a vision for growth that extended beyond just short-term profits. But more than that, he spoke of transparency, accountability, and the kind of leadership that valued every employee, not just the ones who fit a certain mold. "William sees this company as his," Jerome continued, "but the truth is, it belongs to the people who work here, who invest their time, their skills, and yes, their money. They deserve a leader who sees them, respects them, and values what they bring to the table." Robert leaned back, letting out a low whistle. "You make a convincing case, Jerome. But this is William Cross we're talking about. He's not just going to step aside." Jerome's gaze hardened, his voice lowering slightly. "He won't have to. When the board meets next week, I'll have enough votes to make sure of that." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Robert said nothing. He was impressed, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. "You're playing a risky game, my friend. If this doesn't work, it will," Jerome interrupted, his tone firm. "Because this isn't just about me, or even about William. It's about setting things right, and making sure that arrogance doesn't get to dictate who succeeds and who doesn't." The conversation with Robert was only one of many. Jerome knew that he needed more than just a plan, he needed allies, people who could see beyond William's facade and understand the true potential of what Cross Innovations could be under new leadership. Over the next few days, he met with several other shareholders, each meeting carefully orchestrated, each conversation building toward the same goal. And slowly, but surely, they began to see things his way. But William, oblivious as ever, continued to play his part. He strutted through the halls of his company, barking orders, making decisions without consulting anyone, all the while unaware of the quiet storm brewing around him. In his mind, Jerome was already forgotten, just another failed attempt at breaking into a world he had no place in. William didn't see the late-night meetings, the whispers in the corridors, the emails exchanged between board members. He didn't see how the foundation he had built on arrogance was starting to crumble. The night before the board meeting, William sat in his office, confident that everything was under control. He had spent the evening preparing his presentation, outlining his vision for the next quarter, and he was certain it would be enough to keep everyone on his side. After all, he had done this countless times before. But as he glanced at the clock, he noticed an email notification, a message from one of the board members he hadn't spoken to in weeks. He opened it, skimming the contents quickly, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a pang of uncertainty. The email was brief, almost cryptic, but it hinted at concerns, questions about the company's future, and, most disturbingly, support for new leadership. William's fingers tightened around his phone, his mind racing. What new leadership? Who would dare? He didn't finish the thought. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered that calm, composed figure from the boardroom weeks ago, the man he had dismissed without a second thought. He had assumed that Jerome Turner was just another ambitious investor, someone who didn't know his place. But now, the pieces were starting to come together, and a cold realization washed over him. Jerome hadn't come to Cross Innovations to pitch an idea, he had come to take over. And William, in his arrogance, had played right into his hands. As the clock ticked closer to the board meeting, the tension grew, not just for William, but for everyone who had watched the power dynamics play out. Jerome's plan was bold, and there was no guarantee it would work. But he was prepared, and he had one final move to make, one that would decide everything. The stage was set. Tomorrow, everything would be revealed, and the question that hung over everyone's heads was simple: who would emerge victorious, the man who thought he had all the power, or the one who had quietly taken it from him without a single word? The boardroom was unusually quiet that morning. It was the day of the quarterly meeting, and William Cross had arrived early, hoping to project his usual air of control. He was dressed in his sharpest suit, the kind that screamed success, as if he could intimidate his way through whatever unease had crept into his thoughts the night before. He needed to remind everyone who was in charge, to show that he was still the commanding presence they were used to. As the executives began to filter into the room, William took his place at the head of the table, glancing briefly at each face. There were the familiar nods, the polite, almost fearful smiles, but also a few looks he couldn't quite place. It made him uneasy, but he quickly pushed the feeling aside. Today was about solidifying his authority, quelling any doubts about his leadership, and making sure any whispers about new leadership were crushed before they could gain traction. He was still mentally preparing his opening remarks when the door opened again, and in walked Jerome Turner, calm and composed, just as he had been in their last encounter. William's eyes narrowed, and he felt a pang of irritation. Why was he here? The meeting wasn't open to outside investors. But Jerome's presence was not only unanticipated, it was unsettling. As Jerome took a seat at the far end of the table, there was a murmur, a flicker of curiosity among the board members. William forced a smile, leaning back in his chair, trying to project confidence. I didn't realize we were opening the floor to guests today, he said, his tone light but laced with condescension. I thought this was a meeting for the people who actually run the company. Jerome met his gaze, unflinching. I'm exactly where I need to be, he replied, his voice steady. And by the end of this meeting, I'm sure you'll understand why. The words carried a quiet weight, and for a moment, William felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. He was about to respond, to shut down whatever game Jerome thought he was playing, when one of the senior board members, Robert Pierce, cleared his throat and spoke up. Before we begin, I think there's a matter that needs to be addressed, Robert said, his voice measured, but firm. We've received a proposal from Mr. Turner, and I believe it's something the board should consider. William's smile faltered. A proposal? He looked from Robert to Jerome, trying to mask his confusion with disdain. And what exactly does Mr. Turner have to propose that's relevant to this company? Jerome didn't wait for anyone else to speak. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, and began to address the room, his voice clear and composed. I've been observing Cross Innovations for some time now. I've seen the potential it has, the talent that's been underutilized, and the opportunities that have been missed. But I've also seen the problems, issues that start from the top, with leadership that refuses to adapt. William's face tightened, his eyes narrowing. Are you suggesting that I'm the problem, Mr. Turner? Jerome didn't flinch. I'm stating a fact, Mr. Cross. The numbers don't lie. Under your leadership, the company has seen declining revenues, missed opportunities for partnerships, and a loss of investor confidence. You've chosen to ignore those facts, and that's why we're here today. The tension in the room was palpable. Some of the board members shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between William and Jerome, as if unsure of where this confrontation was headed. William's jaw clenched, and he forced out a chuckle, but it came out hollow, lacking the confidence he had tried to muster earlier. You think you can waltz in here and tell me how to run my company? William said, his voice rising. This is my business, my legacy. I built it from the ground up, and I don't need some outsider telling me how to do my job. Jerome remained calm, unbothered by William's outburst. It's not your company, William. It belongs to the shareholders, the people who have invested their money, time, and trust in its success. And those shareholders deserve leadership that will secure their future, not drag it down. William was about to retort when Robert interjected. Jerome has a point, William. The board has been discussing these concerns for a while now. We've seen the reports, the numbers, and it's clear that something needs to change. William's eyes widened, and he looked around the table, searching for support, but all he saw were faces that avoided his gaze. The realization was beginning to set in, and with it, a creeping sense of panic. You can't be serious, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. You're actually considering this coup. Jerome's eyes softened, but his resolve was unshakable. It's not a coup, William. It's a necessary change. And it's already happening. As Jerome spoke those words, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents, placing them neatly on the table. Over the past few weeks, I've been acquiring shares, quietly building my stake in Cross Innovations. As of last night, I now hold a controlling interest. I'm the majority shareholder. The room went silent. William's face turned pale, and for a moment, he seemed to be at a loss for words. He had known there were rumblings, whispers of changes, but he had never imagined it would come to this. The room, once his stage, now felt like a trap closing around him. You can't do this, William stammered, trying to regain his composure. You think you can just buy your way in and take over? I'll fight this. I'll fight all you want, Jerome interrupted, his voice still calm but now carrying an edge of finality. But it won't change the facts. You've had years to steer this company in the right direction, and you've failed. The board has already seen the numbers, and they've seen my plan. They know what's best for the future of this company, and it's not you. William's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to regain control, but every move he thought of felt futile. He had been so focused on maintaining his image, his authority, that he had missed the quiet, strategic maneuvers happening right under his nose. And now, here he was, facing the consequences of his own arrogance. You're making a mistake, William said, his voice barely more than a whisper now. This company needs me. No, William, Jerome said, his eyes meeting William's with a calm, unyielding gaze. This company needed you to be a leader, and you chose to be a tyrant. But the good news is, it can still thrive. It just needs someone who sees its potential, not just its profits. Robert cleared his throat again, breaking the tension that had settled over the room. The board has already voted, William. Effective immediately, Jerome Turner will be taking over as the new CEO of Cross Innovations. The finality of those words hit William like a punch to the gut. He sat back in his chair, staring blankly at the table, as if trying to process what had just happened. For so long, he had seen himself as untouchable, the king of his own empire. But now, that empire had been taken from him, not through force, but through a quiet, strategic brilliance that he had never anticipated. Jerome stood up, gathering his documents, and as he did, he looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each person seated at the table. "I'm not here to destroy what's been built," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority. "I'm here to build on it, to take this company to new heights. And I hope you'll join me in that vision." As Jerome walked toward the door, William found his voice again, though it was shaky, almost desperate. "This isn't over, Turner. You'll regret this. They'll regret this." Jerome paused, turning back to face him one last time. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but I doubt it. Because unlike you, I don't need to rely on fear to lead. And that's why, in the end, they chose me." With that, Jerome left the room, leaving behind a man who had once thought himself invincible, now forced to confront the reality of his own downfall. The boardroom was still, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning, and for the first time, William Cross found himself truly alone, stripped of the power he had clung to for so long. But for Jerome, this was just the beginning. He had won the battle, but now he had to prove that his vision could turn Cross Innovations into what it had always been capable of becoming. And as he stepped out into the bustling city of Detroit, he felt a sense of purpose, a quiet, steady resolve. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that, more than anything, was a victory worth fighting for. The stage was set for a new chapter, and Jerome was ready to lead. Jerome stepped out of the boardroom, but he couldn't fully escape the tension that still crackled in the air. He knew that taking the role of CEO was only the beginning, there were challenges ahead, and not everyone would welcome the change. As he walked down the sleek, polished halls of Cross Innovations, his mind was already spinning with plans, strategies, and ideas on how to navigate the upcoming storm. But one thing was clear, he had succeeded in dismantling the arrogance that had once ruled this company, and for that, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Back in the boardroom, William Cross sat slumped in his chair, still reeling from the announcement. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in, slowly, painfully. He had lost his company, his position, everything he had built his identity around. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers, but he couldn't find the words. For a man who had always prided himself on being in control, the sensation of helplessness was almost suffocating. He didn't have to wait long to confront it. Jerome's assistant, a young, sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, entered the room with a calm professionalism that William found almost mocking. "Mr. Cross," she said, her tone respectful yet firm, "Mr. Turner has requested a follow-up meeting with you. He'd like to discuss the transition process and how best to move forward." William looked up, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Transition?" he spat, the word leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. "You think I'm just going to roll over and hand everything over to him? This is still my company." Lisa didn't flinch. "I understand this is difficult, Mr. Cross. But the board has made its decision, and Mr. Turner is the new CEO. He wants to ensure that the transition is as smooth as possible for everyone involved, including you." William's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white. "He can't just push me out like this. I built this place. I made it what it is. And you all think you can just replace me?" "There are legalities to be addressed, of course," Lisa replied, maintaining her composure. "But Mr. Turner has expressed a willingness to work through them amicably. He wants to avoid any unnecessary conflict." William felt the sting of those words, the implication that any conflict would be his doing. "Amicably," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "How noble of him." The assistant simply nodded, taking a step back. "The meeting is set for this afternoon. I'll be sure to notify you of the time." With that, she left the room, leaving William alone with his thoughts. For a moment, he considered not showing up, just walking out and leaving the mess behind. But no, that would be too easy, too much like surrender. If Jerome wanted to face him again, then William would make sure it wasn't on his terms. The hours passed slowly, and when the time for the meeting came, William found himself once again walking the same path he had taken every day for years. Only now, it felt different. The halls that once felt like an extension of his power now seemed foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. And perhaps, he thought bitterly, they did. He entered the meeting room to find Jerome already there, standing by the window with a distant, thoughtful expression. When Jerome turned, there was no hint of gloating on his face, no smug satisfaction. Just calm, measured seriousness. It was almost worse than if he had been smirking. "William," Jerome began, his voice steady. "Thank you for coming. I wanted to speak with you directly, to clear the air and make sure we're on the same page." William's lip curled into a sneer. "Cut the formalities, Turner. You won. You took everything. What else is there to say?" "I didn't take anything," Jerome said quietly, his tone firm but not unkind. "I bought shares, just like any other investor. And I did it because I believe in the potential of this company, even if you've lost sight of it." The words were simple, but they struck deep. William felt a flash of anger, his pride bristling. "Lost sight? You have no idea what I've done for this company. The risks I've taken, the deals I've made. Everything I did was to keep this place afloat. And I respect that," Jerome said, taking a step closer, his eyes locking onto William's. "I know what it's like to build something from nothing, to pour everything you have into it. But you have to understand, sometimes, holding on too tightly can do more harm than good." William's expression twisted with frustration. "Easy for you to say. You get to come in here, buy your way to the top, and act like you know what's best. But you weren't here when things were falling apart, when we had to make tough decisions." Jerome's gaze softened slightly. "No, I wasn't. But I'm here now, and I want to make sure that those tough decisions don't destroy what's left of this company. I want to bring it back, to make it stronger. And I'm asking you to help me do that." The room fell silent, the tension thick and heavy. For a moment, William was taken aback. This wasn't the confrontation he had expected. He had come here ready to fight, to defend his legacy, but instead, he was being asked to be a part of something bigger than himself. And it was infuriating because deep down, he knew there was truth in Jerome's words. "You're asking me to step aside," William said, his voice low and strained. "To admit that I failed." "I'm asking you to step back," Jerome corrected gently. "So that we can rebuild, together. That doesn't mean you're being pushed out completely. I want to find a way for you to stay involved, if you're willing to see beyond the power struggle." William looked at him, and for a moment, he didn't see a rival, but someone who was genuinely offering him a way forward, a way to salvage some part of what he had built. But pride is a difficult thing to swallow, and for William, it felt like a bitter pill he wasn't ready to take. "And if I refuse?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jerome's expression didn't change. "Then I'll still move forward, because I have to. For the sake of everyone who works here, for the future of this company. But I'd rather do it with your cooperation than without it." The words lingered in the air, and William felt a tightness in his chest, a conflict he hadn't expected. It was the first time in a long while that someone had spoken to him like this, not as an adversary, but as a man trying to find common ground. And it forced him to confront a truth he had been avoiding, that his grip on the company had been slipping long before Jerome had ever walked through those doors. "What do you want from me, Turner?" William said finally, his voice strained, as if each word was pulled out against his will. "I want your experience, your knowledge," Jerome said. "You know this company better than anyone, and there are things I can learn from you. But that can only happen if you're willing to let go of the need to control everything. I'm not here to take away your achievements, William. I'm here to build on them." The room was still, and for a long moment, William didn't speak. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him, years of effort, pride, and a stubborn refusal to see that his way wasn't always the best. He had spent so long trying to be the one in control that he had forgotten what it meant to truly lead. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I don't know how to let go." Jerome stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and extended his hand. "Then let me show you how," he said softly. "One step at a time. Starting now." William stared at the offered hand, a symbol of everything he had been fighting against, and yet, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out and shook it, a gesture that felt both strange and liberating. "I don't like you, Turner," William said, his tone laced with a mix of resentment and reluctant respect. "But maybe this doesn't have to be the end." Jerome nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It doesn't. It's just a new beginning." And with that, the room seemed to breathe again, the tension easing just a fraction. There was still a long road ahead, full of challenges and hard decisions, but for the first time, they weren't standing on opposite sides. For the first time, there was a chance to move forward, not as adversaries, but as allies, however unlikely it might have seemed. And as Jerome walked out of the room, he knew that this was the start of something bigger than just a corporate takeover. It was about changing the way things had been done, about proving that there was strength in humility, in cooperation, and in the willingness to embrace change. William had underestimated him once, but Jerome was determined to make sure that, from now on, no one else would. The handshake between Jerome and William marked a moment of uneasy truce, a fragile bridge over what had been a deep chasm of rivalry and resentment. But as they left the room that day, both men understood that the true challenge was only beginning. The reorganization of Cross Innovations wasn't just about new leadership, it was about redefining the very culture of the company, and that would require more than just signatures on a piece of paper. It would demand a shift in mindset, not just for William, but for everyone who had grown comfortable with the status quo. In the days that followed, Jerome took his place as CEO with a quiet but assertive presence. He moved through the offices, not like a conqueror surveying his spoils, but as someone genuinely curious about the people who made up the company. He listened, asked questions, and made it clear that he valued the input of everyone, from the highest-ranking executives to the interns. It was a stark contrast to William's rule, where decisions often felt like decrees handed down from on high, with little room for dissent or dialogue. It wasn't long before the effects of this new approach began to show. Employees who had once felt stifled under William's rigid management style started to speak up, sharing ideas and solutions that had been ignored or dismissed in the past. Meetings, once tense and one-sided, became lively discussions. Jerome had made it clear that he wanted to cultivate an environment where everyone felt they had a stake in the company's success, and slowly, that vision began to take root. But not everyone was convinced. For some, especially those who had thrived under William's leadership, the changes felt like a threat. There were murmurs of discontent, quiet grumblings about outsiders coming in and disrupting the way things had always been done. For them, the company's identity was closely tied to William's leadership, and they couldn't imagine it flourishing without him at the helm. One afternoon, during a meeting with the senior management team, Jerome could sense the unease. He had laid out a plan for expanding the company's product line, a bold move that would require significant investment and a shift in strategy. Most of the team seemed receptive, but there were a few skeptical faces in the room, and Jerome could tell they were waiting for someone else to speak. That someone, as it turned out, was Michael Harris, a longtime executive who had been one of William's closest allies. Michael had been with the company since its early days and had a reputation for speaking his mind. Today was no different. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, and addressed Jerome with a tone that was both respectful and defiant. "This all sounds very ambitious, Mr. Turner," he began, carefully choosing his words. "But I can't help but wonder if we're moving too fast. Cross Innovations has always been about steady, calculated growth. These plans, they're risky. And I'm not sure they align with the company's core values." Jerome didn't react immediately. He had anticipated pushback, and he welcomed it. He knew that if he was going to earn the trust of the team, he couldn't just dictate changes, he had to address their concerns, understand their perspectives. "I appreciate your honesty, Michael," Jerome said, his voice calm and measured. "And I understand why you might see it that way. But I believe that steady, calculated growth can sometimes turn into complacency. We've been doing the same things, the same way, for a long time, and it's gotten us to where we are now. But if we want to grow, really grow, we need to be willing to take some risks." Michael's expression didn't change. "And if those risks don't pay off, we could lose everything. The company has a lot at stake, and I'm not sure we can afford to gamble with its future." Jerome leaned forward, meeting Michael's gaze. "I'm not asking anyone to gamble. I'm asking us to invest. In new ideas, in new markets, and most importantly, in the people who work here. Cross Innovations isn't just a tech company, it's a collection of brilliant, creative minds who have been waiting for a chance to show what they can do. If we don't give them that chance, we're the ones limiting their potential." There was a pause, and Jerome could see Michael considering his words. But before he could respond, another voice cut in, one that took everyone by surprise. "I think we should listen to him," William said, his tone quiet but firm. Every head in the room turned toward William, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, mostly silent throughout the meeting. Jerome hadn't expected him to speak up, and he certainly hadn't expected him to be supportive. But there was William, looking more composed than he had in days, and for the first time, there was no trace of defiance in his eyes. "Jerome's right," William continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I've spent a lot of years playing it safe, making decisions that kept us steady but didn't allow us to grow. And I see now that it's not enough. If we're going to survive, we need to adapt, and that means being willing to try new things, even if it scares us." The room was silent, the weight of William's admission sinking in. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, one that surprised even him. He had always prided himself on being the man with all the answers, the one who never showed weakness. But today, he had chosen to lay down that shield, to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, someone else could lead them where he couldn't. Jerome took a deep breath, feeling the shift in the room. It wasn't just about gaining William's support, it was about earning the trust of everyone who had followed him. "I know it's not easy to embrace change," he said, his voice steady. "But I believe in this company, and I believe in the people who work here. I'm not here to replace what you've built. I'm here to make sure it can grow, to give it a future. And I'm asking you to trust me, even if it feels uncomfortable right now." Michael, who had been listening intently, finally nodded, a reluctant but genuine sign of agreement. "All right," he said, the resistance in his voice softening. "Let's see where this goes." The meeting ended on a cautiously optimistic note, and as the team filed out, Jerome caught William's eye. There was a moment of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had just taken place. It wasn't a victory for Jerome alone, it was a step forward for the company, one that might not have been possible if William hadn't been willing to let go of his pride, if only for a moment. But as Jerome returned to his office, he knew there were still battles to be fought. Winning over the team was one thing, but there were deeper, more ingrained issues within Cross Innovations that wouldn't be resolved overnight. And then there was William. His apparent support was a welcome surprise, but Jerome couldn't ignore the possibility that it might not last. Old habits die hard, and he knew better than to assume that one meeting could erase years of entrenched behavior. The real test came a few days later, when Jerome called for an all-staff meeting, inviting everyone in the company to gather in the main auditorium. It was a bold move, one that hadn't been done in years, and there was a buzz of anticipation as employees shuffled into their seats, curious to see what this new CEO had to say. As Jerome took the stage, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, waiting, judging. He took a moment to collect himself before speaking, letting the room settle into a quiet stillness. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "I know there's been a lot of change recently, and change can be unsettling. But I want to be clear about one thing: I'm not here to tear down what you've built. I'm here because I see a future for this company, and I see a future that involves each and every one of you." He paused, scanning the room, trying to gauge the reaction. Some faces were skeptical, others intrigued, but most were just listening, waiting to see where he was going. "When I first came here, I was met with skepticism, and I understand why," Jerome continued. "But I'm asking you to give me a chance. I want to hear your ideas, your concerns, and your hopes for this company. I want us to build something together, something that makes us proud." There was a murmur of approval, a few nods scattered throughout the crowd. But the moment that truly captured their attention was when William stepped forward, taking a place beside Jerome on the stage. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. "I know I'm not the easiest person to work with," William said, his tone uncharacteristically humble. "And I know I haven't always made the best decisions. But I believe in this company, and I believe in what Jerome is trying to do. So, if you're willing to trust him, I'm willing to do the same." It was a turning point, one that resonated deeply with the employees who had seen the company through its highs and lows. William's endorsement, however reluctant, gave them the permission they needed to embrace the changes, to see Jerome not as an outsider, but as a leader worth following. As the applause echoed through the auditorium, Jerome felt a sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The real work was just beginning, and there would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But for the first time, there was a sense of unity, a shared vision of what cross-innovations could become. And that, more than anything, was what Jerome had been fighting for. Months passed, and the transformation within cross-innovations was undeniable. Under Jerome's leadership, the company began to flourish in ways that few had imagined possible. The new initiatives he had proposed brought fresh energy to the team, sparking innovation and creativity. Departments that had once struggled under rigid, top-down management now thrived, as employees felt empowered to take risks, share ideas, and contribute to the company's success. The results spoke for themselves: new partnerships, increased revenue, and a revitalized brand that had once been synonymous with stagnation. Jerome had proven himself, not through flashy displays of power, but by listening, adapting, and making sure every person in the company felt seen and valued. He had taken the time to understand the intricacies of the business, and in doing so, he earned the respect of those who had initially doubted him. It was more than just a turnaround, it was a rebirth. And in that process, Jerome had done something even more remarkable: he had managed to win over William Cross. William had initially struggled with the shift. Letting go of the control he had clung to for so long wasn't easy, and there were moments when his old habits threatened to resurface. But Jerome's approach, steady, respectful, and unwavering, had given William something he hadn't felt in years: a sense of purpose without the need for dominance. Over time, William found a new role within the company, one that allowed him to focus on what he did best: mentorship, product development, and strategic guidance. He no longer needed to be the face of cross-innovations, but he could still be its heart. It was a surprising transition, even to William himself. He had spent so much of his life defining success as being at the top, that he hadn't realized there was another way to be impactful. He didn't need to control everything to be valuable. Watching Jerome lead the company with a mix of humility and strength made him see leadership in a new light. It was a lesson he had learned too late to save his own legacy as CEO, but not too late to change how he approached his future. In a way, William's story was one of redemption, not because he had regained power, but because he had found peace in relinquishing it. He continued to work at Cross Innovations, not as the ruler, but as a contributor. And that, perhaps, was a more profound victory than anything he had achieved before. Jerome, on the other hand, had come full circle. His journey from an underestimated outsider to the leader of one of Detroit's most promising companies was a testament to perseverance and quiet strength. He had not only proven his worth but had done so on his terms, without compromising his principles. The day he stood before the company's employees to announce their latest successful product launch, he saw the pride and excitement on their faces, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment he had rarely allowed himself to feel. This was his moment, and he had earned it. As he wrapped up his speech, Jerome caught sight of William standing at the back of the room, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, there was a mutual understanding, a respect that had been hard-won but was now unshakable. William gave a nod, as if to say, "You did it." And Jerome, in turn, nodded back, acknowledging the journey that had brought them both to this point. The success of Cross Innovations wasn't just about business, it was about the people who had made it possible, and the willingness to believe in something greater than themselves. Jerome's story was no longer just his, it was the story of every employee who had found a voice, of every investor who had dared to dream, and of every leader who had learned that strength wasn't about holding on, but about knowing when to let go. Every journey to success is filled with challenges, and sometimes, those challenges come from the very people we think are in our way. But Jerome's story teaches us something important: real power doesn't come from forcing others down, it comes from lifting them up. In a world where leadership is often mistaken for dominance, this story is a reminder that true leaders are those who listen, adapt, and grow alongside those they lead. William's journey, too, offers a lesson. Redemption isn't always about getting back what you lost. Sometimes, it's about finding a new way forward, even if it means changing how you define success. It's never too late to let go of pride and start anew, and that's a kind of strength not everyone has the courage to show. So, what did this story mean to you? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up against someone more powerful, or perhaps let go of control to allow growth? We'd love to hear your thoughts, share them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of unexpected twists, resilience, and powerful lessons, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Tales of Twist. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. We'll keep bringing you stories that surprise, inspire, and make you think. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next story.